Before time had a tongue to name the hours, before empires dared to rise or fall, there was a silence in the mountains, a breath held across peaks dusted with snow and centuries, a hush not of absence, but of waiting. The Andes, vast and vigilant, stood like old gods with their backs to the sky, gazing not down in judgment, but inward through mist, stone, and memory. Beneath their sacred spines, the world had not yet decided what it was. There, on a ridge kissed first by the dawn, a golden thread began to stir. This is the story of Tawantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters. A kingdom born not of metal or blood alone, but of woven myth and whispering stone. The Inca Empire, the last great light of the Andes before the Spanish winds blew dust across the stars. But before there were empires, there was a lake. Lake Titicaca, still as myth itself, breathed stories into the thin air. They say the sun rose from here, not as fire, but as presence, and from its light came the children of the gods. Manco Capac, the first son, walked from those sacred waters with a golden staff and a mission, not his own, to find the place where that staff would sink, soft and soundless, into the earth. That would be the heart of the empire, the navel of the world, Cusco. It is from that breath, from that single sinking of gold into soil, that the Inca Empire would one day rise. Not as a kingdom of conquest alone, but as an offering to the sun. But tonight, we do not begin with conquest. We begin with waiting. The land, ancient even then, watched the slow shuffle of men and gods with equal silence. Mountain paths wound like veins across the high stone body of the Andes. Smoke curled from cooking fires, long before the Spanish ever saw smoke as a sign of life. Llamas padded across ridges like living prayers, and the people, Quechua speaking, earth tending, sky reading, passed down not scrolls or stones, but stories stitched into cloth and patterns etched into the tilt of terrace walls. Each rock held intention. Each breath was shared with the ancestors. Each ritual a dialogue between the living and the eternal. They did not yet call themselves Inca, not in the way we do now. Inca was a title, not a people. A word meaning lord, ruler, child of the sun. And before there was one Inca to rule all others, there were dozens of Elis, kinship clans, each with their gods, their mountains, their own sliver of the sacred. The Andes did not kneel easily to unity. They held fast to diversity, until something stirred. A call, not from the heavens, but from the land itself. Not a war drum, but a whisper. Now, there are moments in history that do not announce themselves, not with thunder, not with fire. They are small, the shift of a shadow, the bend of a river, the way a single seed dares to take root. So it was when one family, high in the Cusco Valley, began to look not only at their own fields, but toward the horizon. They dreamed of more. Not out of greed, but obligation. The gods had given them breath. The sun had granted them warmth. In return, they would build something worthy. So, slowly, with the patience of mountains, the first stones were laid. Not just for shelter, but for memory. Not for war, but for alignment with the stars. Each temple in Cusco was not a monument to power, but a dialogue with the divine. The city was shaped like a puma, teeth at the fortress of Sacsayhuaman, tail curling into the valley below, the sacred animal of strength, the guardian between this world and the next, and overhead, the Milky Way, the Mayu, mirrored the rivers below. As above, so below, this was not architecture, it was cosmology made stone. Yet for all the reverence, all the sacred threads woven through the land, the call to greatness was not gentle forever. Empires do not rise by worship alone. There would be resistance, battles, betrayal. Brothers would turn against brothers. Gods would demand sacrifice. And beyond the mountains, across oceans still unknown, another tide was rising. A tide of steel and foreign tongues that would one day come to shatter what the sun had kissed. But we are not there yet. Tonight we begin in stillness, on the cusp of memory, when stone had just begun to listen. We rest in the hush before the name Inca carried empires in its mouth, before the emperor wore gold like second skin, before the roads stretched farther than Rome's. We begin with a staff sinking into soil, with a golden thread descending from the heavens, with a silence broken only by the whisper of the sun. And so the journey begins. Let us walk slowly. The Andes are patient, and history waits for no one, save those who listen. Long before stone was measured into cities, before gold was pressed into crowns or blood into treaties, the ancestors watched the sky. They did not write with ink. They traced lineage in the wind, in the patterns of rivers, in the color of woven cloth passed from mother to child. Their wisdom was not etched in marble, but carried in song, low, slow, and deep like the murmur of the mountain itself. Here, we return to Lake Titicaca, the navel of the first memory. Its surface holds the sky like a mirror, unbroken, eternal. And beneath that mirrored hush, legend stirs. The elders say that after the long night, a time when the world was shadowed, formless, the god Viracocha rose from the lake's blue mouth. He walked upon the waters as if they were earth. He summoned the sun, the moon, and the stars, not with a clash of power, but with a breath. He gave light to the sky and form to the chaos, and from clay he shaped the first people. Yet they were flawed, violent, too quick to forget the gods. So he flooded the world, not out of cruelty, but as a craftsman resets his wheel, not to destroy, but to begin again. From that second making, a better world was born. Viracocha sent his children, Manco Capac and Mama Oclo, into this new dawn, not as kings, but as seekers. He placed in their hands a golden staff, a gift and a test, and told them to search for a place where it would sink into the earth without resistance. That would be their sign, the chosen place where civilization could root itself and bloom. Some say they walked north through harsh winds and thin air, past lakes that whispered and valleys that echoed their footsteps. Others say they emerged not from the lake, but from the depths of a cave called Pacarictambo, the House of Dawn. There, the ancestors lived underground, awaiting their time to rise into the light of this world. What matters is not the path, but the pattern. Emergence, wandering, revelation. Where the golden staff sank, in the rich belly of the Cusco Valley. They paused. Manco Capac lifted his eyes to the sky. The earth had spoken, the center of the world had been found, and so the lines began. Not lines on maps, not yet, but sacred lineages, panacas, royal bloodlines tied to the sun itself. Every Inca who followed would claim descent from this divine pair. Every ruler would be a thread in the tapestry that stretched backward to the lake, to the cave, to the god who breathed life into clay. The Inca did not see time as a river that flows from past to future, but as a circle, a woven spiral. The past was never lost. It lived beside them. The ancestors walked with them, fed beside them, spoke through the wind, danced in the fields. Every act of planting or building was not merely survival. It was ceremony. Each field was sown not just with seed, but with memory. This was the soil from which Tawantinsuyu would grow. A world of Elis, clans bound by land and kin, who understood the land as a living being, not a possession. The mountains were not obstacles. They were apus, sacred spirits, watchers of the people. One did not pass by an apu without prayer. One did not take from the earth without offering. Even water had its own guardians, its own moods. To live was to be in constant conversation with the world, And yet among these Elis, one lineage would rise. Not through war, not yet, but through patience, marriage, alliance, and faith. The Inca dynasty began as but one family among many, but they carried something different, a vision that time could be shaped, just as stone was shaped, just as cloth was woven. They did not rush. Instead, they watched. The early rulers, Sinchiroka, Lyoke Yupanqui, Maita Kapak, built slowly, each laying foundations invisible to enemies, but known to the ancestors. Terraces to tame the hillsides, temples to speak with the sky, rituals to bind communities through shared memory. The empire was not yet an empire. It was still a prayer. And always, always, the sun, Inti, the father of emperors. His warmth lit the path of destiny. His absence in the cold nights reminded them of mortality. Every Inca was his child, not metaphorically, but truly. To challenge the Inca was to challenge the sun, an act unthinkable in a world stitched together by divinity. Time passed like fog through mountain passes, slow, mysterious, and sacred. Generations turned. And then, in the mid-14th century, a child was born who would change everything. His name was Kusi Yupanqui, later crowned as Pachacuti, he who turns the earth. But that name has not yet been spoken in this chapter. His shadow waits just beyond the rim of time. For now, we linger in origins, not as tourists, but as witnesses. We rest with the ancestors beside the fire. We listen as a grandmother hums a song her grandmother sang before her, a melody older than empire, older than conquest, a song not of victory, but of belonging, to stone, to mountain, to time itself. The Inca world is not yet born in full, but it dreams. And in the dream, golden roads stretch like sunbeams across valleys not yet touched by war. Empires do not awaken in thunder. They emerge like mountains, slowly, from fire and pressure, until one day they cast shadows no one can ignore. So it was with the Inca. Not an empire born, but an empire becoming. It began with a tremor, not of the earth, but of fate. The boy named Kusi Yupanqui, born into quiet lineage, third in line for power, was never expected to rule. His father, Viracocha Inca, held the throne of Cusco and looked outward with wary eyes, sensing the threat of the Chanca, fierce warriors from the west. The threat grew louder each year, and with it, fear. When the Chanca armies finally marched toward Cusco, burning villages and bending the sky with their war cries, the king chose exile over battle. He fled the sacred city, taking the crown with him. But Kusi Yupanqui remained. Just a boy, just a son, with no coronation, no legions, only a fire in the chest and ancestors at his back. With a few loyal captains and the blessing of the sun, he stood before the gates of Cusco and swore not to surrender. They say the stones themselves stood beside him, that the mummies of his royal ancestors, kept embalmed in the city, fed and dressed and spoken to, whispered strategies into the ears of the living, that the gods of the mountains watched and the sun burned brighter, and when the Chanca came, they were not met by retreat, but by fury, righteous, burning, and eternal. Against all odds, Cusco held, the Chanca fell, and Kusi Yupanqui, once the quiet sun, took a new name, not of man, but of myth, Pachacuti, he who turns the earth. A title not of conquest alone, but of transformation. He would not simply rule, he would reshape the world. Thus began the expansion. It did not happen all at once. It moved like light spilling over stone, first slow, then unstoppable. Pachacuti looked at the world not with a king's hunger, but with a stonemason's eye. Every valley had potential, every people could be woven into a greater design. He was not only a conqueror, he was an architect of time. His vision was not chaos, it was order, sacred and celestial. From the valleys of Arequipa to the edges of the sacred valley, he sent out scouts, engineers, priests. Roads were drawn not to the shortest route, but to align with sex, invisible sacred lines stretching from Cusco like rays from the sun. Along these lines were built temples, springs, huacas, each a spiritual station in the vast anatomy of the empire, and always the stone. The Inca did not just build, they carved silence into stone. At Sacsayhuaman, the fortress above Cusco, boulders larger than elephants were fitted together with such impossible precision that not even a blade of grass could slide between them. No mortar, no steel, just patience and faith that stone, like people, could be shaped. Masons said the stones had souls, that to cut one wrong was to anger the spirit within. So they listened, they whispered, they carried the rocks on ropes and backs, sometimes for miles, up mountainsides steep as prayers, and when the final stone slid into place with a soft sigh, not a clang, the city was not just protected, it was completed. But Pachacuti's vision was not limited to walls. He restructured the cosmos. He reorganized the empire into Tawantinsuyu, the four quarters, each a vast province with its own governor, language, terrain, and history. At the center of all things stood Cusco, the Cosco, the navel of the world, where all lines met, both literal and divine. A great system of quipu, knotted strings used to record data, became the pulse of administration. Messengers called shaski ran in relays across thousands of miles of paved roads, carrying messages, stories, census numbers, and commands. The empire had no written language, and yet it remembered everything. What could not be written was woven. What could not be carved was sung. What could not be conquered was honored, absorbed into the Inca cosmology like a star joining a constellation. Local gods were not erased. They were given space within the Inca pantheon. Resistance was met with both might and mercy, depending on how the people listened. This was not colonization. It was integration by divine design. And still the expansion flowed. Under Pachacuti and his son, Tupac Inca Yupanqui, the empire grew beyond imagination. North into the cloud forests of Ecuador, south into the deserts of Chile, across jagged cliffs and arid coastlines, across jungle trails and frozen peaks, the Inca walked with the sun. They left no corner untouched, but even at the empire's height, even as Machu Picchu was raised like a poem in stone above the clouds, even as foreign emissaries whispered of a golden people beyond the mountains, the Inca remained rooted in their sacred geometry. They did not expand for glory. They expanded because the world itself called to be ordered. They believed in balance. Aini, the law of reciprocity. What was given must be returned. The sun gave light, the people gave offerings, the land gave food, the people gave ceremony, the empire gave peace, the people gave loyalty. This balance was not abstract. It was practical, lived and measured in terraces and festivals, in harvests and hymns. And so, like a great loom stretching across the sky, the empire was woven, stone by stone, breath by breath, not in haste, but in harmony. And as the sun dipped behind the peaks, casting long golden trails across the fields, the people paused, not in fear, not in labor, but in reverence. They looked not westward, but inward. Because they knew expansion was never about land. It was about meaning. In the high silence of the Andes, time did not flow like water. It spiraled. Not forward, but inward. Not lost, but folded. To the Inca, the future was not something waiting to arrive, but something already written in the motion of stars, in the breath of wind through maize, in the soft murmur of stone beneath bare feet. Theirs was not a world ruled by kings and swords alone. It was ruled by rhythm, by sun and shadow, by offerings and reciprocity, by the pulse of sky mirrored in the pulse of earth. At the heart of this divine cadence stood the Inti, the sun. Not a symbol, but a living father, a golden eye watching over all. And through his light, the Inca Emperor ruled, not as a man, but as Sapa Inca, the only Inca, the child of the sun. Every word he spoke carried the warmth of the cosmos. Every gesture he made mirrored the balance of heaven and soil. Yet he did not rule alone. His empire was vast, but his power moved through a sacred structure, a divine order shaped not by conquest, but by cosmic alignment. There was Ailu, the family clan unit, the smallest pulse in the empire's vast heart. Each Ailu shared land, work, gods, and ancestors. No one in the Ailu was truly alone. Each life belonged to a greater fabric. Children learned early that the land was not theirs to own, but theirs to tend, just as their parents had, just as their children would, and over the Alis, like a canopy of stars, stretched the empire. Tawantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters, radiated from Cusco, the navel of the world. Each quarter had its own soul, its own flavor of life. The green slopes of Chinchaysuyu to the northwest, the mountain cradles of Antisuyu to the east, the dry spine of Kolasuyu to the south, and the fertile lands of Kuntisuyu to the west. Together, they formed a perfect cross, the Chacana, the Andean cross, symbol of the three realms, the world above, the world below, and the world we walk. In the sacred city of Cusco, all these realms met. Streets curved like constellations. Temples stood where seque lines, invisible threads of energy, converged. The city itself was shaped like a puma, fierce and watchful, its heart the great temple of Coricancha, the house of gold. There, walls were once sheathed, in sheets of pure gold that caught the morning light like fire. It was the holiest place, the navel within the navel, the breathing mouth of the sun's voice. Within Coricancha, priests kept calendars more precise than clocks, using the movement of stars and the cast of shadows to mark time. Solstices were not abstract, they were lived. When the June sun paused in its path and reversed its course, it was not a phenomenon. It was a message from Inti, telling the people that the time of planting was near. And the people answered with ritual. In the sacred month of Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun, all of Cusco shimmered with gold and color. The Sapa Inca, clad in sunburst headdress and woven tunics that glittered like constellations, would offer chicha, the sacred corn drink, to the rising sun. Thousands gathered, not as subjects, but as family, as people woven into the same sacred cloth. Offerings were made. Llamas were sacrificed. Songs were sung that no longer asked, but thanked. It was not fear that bound the people to the divine. It was reverence. This divine order extended beyond the temples. Mita, the labor tax, was not punishment, but duty. People gave their time and hands to build roads, terraces, and storehouses. Not for a ruler, but for the whole. Crops from communal lands filled kolkas, granaries that fed the empire in times of drought. Roads built by calloused hands stretched like veins across the Andes, carrying runners, stories, and salt. Balance was the empire's breath. Aini, the sacred principle of reciprocity, touched every life. You give to the land, and the land gives to you. You serve the state, and the state provides for you. You care for your elders, and you are cared for when your hair turns gray. In this, the Inca did not see themselves as masters of the land, but caretakers of a borrowed world. And still, at the center of it all, the dead. Death was not an end, but a shift. The ancestors remained among the living, dressed and fed, consulted and revered. Mummies of past rulers were carried through the streets on feast days. They held property. They made decisions. The past, to the Inca, was not buried. It was active, present, breathing. To forget the ancestors was to forget the sun. Even war followed divine order. Before battles, envoys offered surrender to enemies. Submission to the Inca brought gifts, safety, even elevation. But resistance meant holy wrath, not cruelty, but cleansing, like fire in a cold house. When new lands were won, their gods were brought to Cusco, given space in temples, not to be erased, but respected within hierarchy. The sun, after all, did not deny the stars. It simply outshone them. In the Inca mind, everything had its place. Stone, sky, man, maze. When balance held, the world sang. When it faltered, even the mountains wept. And so, the people walked carefully. Not in fear, but in awareness. Each step was part of the dance. Each breath was part of the offering. Each day, they rose not into chaos, but into a world arranged by sacred symmetry, where time was measured in sunlight, and meaning came not from conquest, but from connection. The empire, still rising, was not only a structure of stone and law. It was a cosmos, alive, humming with memory. And as the sun arced across the sky, painting terraces in gold and shadow, it was said that even the stars paused to watch. There comes a moment in every great empire, like the deep inhale before a prayer, when the land, the people, and the heavens seem to breathe in unison. And for the Inca, that moment came beneath a sky so clear it revealed not only stars, but the shape of the darkness between them. This was no longer a kingdom of valleys. It was an empire of stone and sky, of rivers bent by will, of mountains tamed by terraces and crowned by cities that whispered to the gods. The name Tawantinsuyu echoed now across 3,000 miles, from the emerald slopes of Ecuador to the deserts of Chile, from the Pacific shorelines to the Amazon's breath. It was not only the largest empire ever born in the Americas. It was one of the most harmoniously designed the world had ever seen. But empires do not climb quietly. It was under the reign of Tupac Inca Yupanqui, son of the earth-turner Pachacuti, that the Inca truly rose like fire from the soil. He was not merely heir to a throne. He was heir to a vision. From the moment he stepped into power, he walked as if history itself waited on his heels. His eyes turned outward. Not out of greed, but of divine ambition. He was a builder, a warrior, a seeker of lands not yet bound by sunlight. He wanted the corners of the world to know the Inca name, not by rumor, but by stone, song, and shadow. His armies marched not as chaos, but as ritual. Every soldier carried not just weapons, but meaning. Before battle, they sang of ancestors and gods. Priests walked with them, reading omens in bird flight and cloud shapes, and when they took a city, they did not raze it. They rewove it into the fabric of the empire. All resistance was met with structure. New lands were mapped, surveyed, assigned to Alice. Roads, perfect, impossibly smooth, stretching across cliffs and gorges, were carved by hand, laid stone by stone. These were the Capac Ñan, the royal roads, a web of veins pulsing through the Andes. Llamas, runners, and caravans moved along them like blood through an empire's heart. At way stations known as tambos, weary travelers found shelter. At rope bridges, strung above bottomless canyons, travelers crossed with breath held and prayers whispered. At summits wrapped in snow and sun, the Inca left offerings, children, llamas, gold, not in cruelty, but in conversation. These were Capacocha sacrifices, sacred dialogues between man and mountain, life and eternity. It was believed that the chosen would walk into the other world, not in sorrow, but in glory, to live beside the gods forever. This was no ordinary ascent. It was divine choreography, set to the rhythm of stars and sun. At its peak, the Inca realm was not a patchwork of conquest, but a mosaic of unity. Each region spoke its own tongue, grew its own maize, danced to its own music, and yet each was tied to Cusco by invisible threads of tribute, ritual, and road. Tupac Inca Yupanqui brought even the distant Chimu Empire to its knees, a powerful coastal realm whose capital, Chan Chan, was the largest adobe city in the world. Rather than destroy it, the Inca absorbed it. Chimu goldsmiths, weavers, and thinkers were brought to Cusco, where they added their brilliance to the Inca cosmos. The empire did not erase cultures. It orchestrated them. Under the Inca, there was no coin, no market, no personal greed. There was labor and abundance. Terraces stair-stepped the mountains like green waves frozen in prayer, each one catching rain, soil, and sunlight with careful reverence. Crops grew in altitudinal harmony. Potatoes in the frost, maize in the warmth, coca leaves in the mist. Every plant knew its place, and so did every hand that tended it. The state stored vast reserves of grain and salt, meat and cloth in thousands of kolkas, storehouses that dotted the empire like stars, and when famine came, or drought or frost, the empire breathed out, and food arrived. No one begged, no one hoarded, all was balance. And still they built. Oh, how they built. Not only fortresses like Ollantaytambo, but sanctuaries like Machu Picchu, a citadel unseen by Spanish eyes, hidden in the mountains like a pearl in mist. There, where the peaks kissed the sky and condors soar like prayers, the Inca left an echo of their sacred soul. Machu Picchu was not a fortress. It was a ceremony in stone. Its walls, its fountains, its terraces, all aligned to solstice and silence. No mortar, no waste. Just stone touching stone like breath upon skin. Even the shadows danced at sunrise. Tupac Inca Yupanqui ruled not with tyranny, but with terrible grace. He knew that to hold the sky in your hands was not triumph, but burden. He understood the weight of divine duty, and when his time ended, the empire passed into the hands of his son, Huayna Capac, who would stretch it even farther, northward into the kingdoms of Quito, to the edge of what the Inca believed was the rim of the world. The empire had never been higher, but empires, like flames, grow brightest before they flicker. The Inca had climbed the sky, and far below, across oceans the Inca did not know, ships had begun to stir, carrying languages, diseases, and gods that would not ask for place in the sacred order, but would demand it. That is still far off. For now, in this moment, the Inca stood sovereign over stone and sky, their empire rising not from greed, but from the bones of the land and the breath of the sun. The drums of ceremony still beat, the runners still ran, and the sun, high in his golden throne, still smiled. Down on Tawantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters, where the road never ended and the stones never forgot. The winds that sweep down from the north carry more than cold air. They carry whispers, faint, distant, like the echo of thunder across a mountain valley. Long before the sun rose over the peaks of Cusco to warm the stones beneath the feet of the Inca, far beyond the borders of the great empire, other powers stirred. Kingdoms older than memory, kingdoms of stone and river, stretched their fingers toward the horizon. To the north, past the fertile valleys and deep rivers, lay the land of the Chachapoya, the warriors of the clouds. Their homes clung to the cliffs like nests of ghosts, draped in mist and shadow. Fierce and proud, they defied the slow march of the empire, their arrows sharp as the wind, their hearts beating to a different drum. Further beyond, the Quito people thrived in the cold heights of modern Ecuador. They whispered of gods born of fire and water, and their shamans danced in the smoke of sacred herbs, calling the spirits of the volcanoes to bear witness. These lands, wild and restless, would soon be drawn into the great orbit of Tawantinsuyu. But for now, they moved like shadows, mysterious and untamed. The northern frontier was a place where the empire's breath met resistance, a place where the future was not yet written in stone or sun, but in the fragile crossing of cultures and dreams. It was here, along the edge of the world, that the great emperor Huayna Capac cast his gaze. Unlike his father, who ruled with the force of mountain storms, Huayna Capac ruled with the patience of glaciers. Slow, powerful, inevitable. He saw the empire as a living being, growing, stretching, dreaming, and he sought to carry its heart into new lands. He sent envoys and armies, priests and builders, to weave new threads into the sacred tapestry. The people of Quito and the Chachapoya were fierce, but the empire was patient. It understood the language of alliances, of marriages, of rituals that bridged the gap between worlds. When war came, it was not only fought with weapons, but with words and offerings. The spoils of battle were not only gold and land, but the weaving together of stories, gods, and memories. The northern lands were harsh. Cold mountain winds that could freeze blood in the veins, forests dense with unknown beasts, rivers that roared like the voices of the ancestors. But they were also rich, with precious metals, fertile valleys, and peoples whose hearts beat in rhythms the empire sought to understand. Huayna Capac moved through these lands like a shadow of the sun itself, warm and unyielding. He built roads where none existed, terraces on impossible slopes, temples where the sky seemed close enough to touch. And with each stone laid, each bridge strung across a canyon, the empire breathed deeper. Yet the northern expansion was more than land or conquest. It was a dialogue, meeting of worlds that carried both promise and peril. For as Tawantinsuyu stretched its arms northward, other forces beyond the horizon began to stir. From across the vast oceans, unseen and unimaginable to the people of the Andes, came the first faint ripples of change, the distant thunder of sails, the faint smell of salt on foreign winds. The empire, vast and radiant, was still wrapped in its own golden light. Yet, far away, new stories were beginning to cross the waters. Stories of men who would not see the world as the Inca did. Stories that carried not harmony, but disruption. For now, Huayna Capac's empire was a tapestry of strength and grace, woven from the soil, the stone, and the spirit of the mountains. But all great tapestries fray at their edges. The northern winds carried more than clouds. They carried a warning. The sun that warmed Tawantinsuyu was still bright, but shadows lengthened in the valleys. And beneath the earth, the great drums of change began to beat. The empire had stretched its limbs from the high peaks to the lush valleys, and its heart beat steadily in the sunlit plazas of Cusco. Yet, like a distant rumble before a tempest, a new presence began to stir at the edges of the world. Along the endless Pacific coastline, where the desert sand met the restless ocean, the Inca faced a land as enigmatic as the stars above. It was a place of sharp contrasts, scorching days and cold nights, fierce currents and still coves, barren plains and sudden bursts of green where the river kissed the earth. The coastal peoples were masters of the sea's moods. They fished the waves with reed boats, their chants rising like prayers to the heavens, their eyes searching the horizon for signs of abundance or danger. Their culture was old, layered like the shells beneath the tide, and their cities, like Chan Chan, spoke in adobe and gold of power that predated even the Inca's dawn. As the empire's reach extended toward the sea, its rulers saw not just new lands to claim, but a new horizon of possibility. The ocean was no longer a boundary, it was a gateway. Huayna Capac, the great sovereign whose name meant the Mighty One, sought to bind the coastal realms to the empire's sacred order. But this was not conquest through fire alone. It was a meeting of worlds, an exchange carved from respect and necessity. The coastal lords and the mountain emperors shared more than trade. They shared myths of the sun and the sea, stories woven from the same threads of stars and spirit. They understood that the earth was a living being, that the waves and the stones were part of the same breath. Yet the sea brought its own mysteries. Along the shorelines, the empire encountered challenges unlike the cold heights of the Andes. The desert winds carried secrets, whispers of strangers who sailed great wooden ships with white wings, bearing weapons that thundered like storms and eyes that looked with hunger. These were not stories carried by the mountains or the rivers. They were omens whispered in the shifting tides and echoed in the cries of seabirds. The Inca knew the meaning of strength. In stone walls, in disciplined armies, in sacred rites that bound man to the divine. But here, at the edge of the world, strength was tested by forces unseen and unknown. And so the empire prepared, not just for war, but for transformation. They sent emissaries along the winding coast, warriors to guard the shores, priests to pray to Inti, the sun god, for guidance. The quipu, knotted strings that recorded not words but meaning, grew longer, carrying messages between distant places, binding the empire's vastness into a living whole. But beneath the steady rhythm of empire, a shadow crept closer. The great empire that had risen from the breath of the mountains, the sweat of terraces, and the prayers of the people now faced the stirring of a force that would test all it had built. Far across the Atlantic, on distant shores cloaked in mist and legend, men sailed with steel and gunpowder, carriers of a world the Inca had not yet imagined. Their arrival was a stone dropped into a still lake, sending ripples that would grow into waves. The sun that had crowned Tawantinsuyu's glory was about to meet the sea's cold embrace. In the quiet nights, beneath constellations that had guided the empire for centuries, the people dreamed, unaware that the course of their history was about to bend in ways only the gods could understand. In the quiet valleys where the river whispers secrets to the stones, the first winds of change began to stir. They arrived softly at first, like the brush of a feather across skin, unnoticed by many. But beneath the calm, the undercurrents of a new era ran deep and swift. The empire, vast and radiant, seemed eternal. Its terraces etched into the mountains like the strokes of a divine hand, its roads weaving an unbroken thread through sky and earth. Cusco stood like the navel of the world, a city bathed in golden light and sacred power. Its temples hummed with prayers, and the priests moved like shadows, guardians of a sacred truth passed down through generations. Yet, even as the sun rose every morning with unfailing grace, the air carried a faint scent of unfamiliar smoke, a restless stirring in the leaves of the eucalyptus trees brought from distant lands. Travelers from the edge of the empire spoke in hushed tones of strangers seen on the coast. Men clad in shining armor, faces pale as moonlight, voices sharp and strange. The elders, who read the stars and listened to the rhythms of the earth, felt a chill beneath the warmth of the sun. They whispered of omens, birds that flew backward, rivers that ran dry, and shadows that lengthened beyond the mountains. Huayna Capac, the great sovereign who bore the weight of empire, like the very mountains bore the sky, faced these signs with the gravity of a man who knew the fragile balance between power and fate. He summoned his priests and generals, seeking wisdom in the patterns of clouds and the entrails of llamas. The empire's reach was at its height, but beneath its shining surface, fissures began to show. A sickness crept quietly through the lands, carried not by swords or conquest, but by invisible breath, the shadow of a distant world intruding upon the Andean paradise. The peoples of Tawantinsuyu had never faced such a foe. Their strength lay in unity, in the sacred reciprocity between earth and sky, man and god. But this unseen enemy was indifferent to prayers, immune to stone walls and sunlit rituals. As the sickness spread, families mourned quietly in the night, their grief carried away by the cold winds that whispered through the valleys. Entire villages faded like morning mist, their names swallowed by silence, Yet the empire held fast. In Cusco, the heart of the realm, the priests performed elaborate ceremonies, offering gold and coca leaves to the gods, beseeching Inti for mercy. The sun god, radiant and distant, seemed both protector and silent witness to the unfolding tragedy. In the midst of suffering, the empire's roads bore the weight of runners, messengers speeding through mountains and deserts, carrying news, prayers, and the hope of relief. The Quipu records, those knotted cords of knowledge and memory, grew longer and more urgent, weaving a tapestry of crisis and endurance. And still, the empire endured. But the sickness was only the beginning. Beyond the silent valleys, the shadows grew deeper. From the sea came new voices, their meaning wrapped in fire and thunder. The strangers, whose ships darkened the horizon like great birds of iron and wood, carried with them not only steel and gunpowder, but a vision of the world that would unmake the ancient order. Their arrival was a rupture in time, a collision of worlds that had slept side by side but never touched. The Inca, children of the sun and stone, had long believed in a cosmic balance, a sacred geometry that held the universe in harmony. But now, the old patterns trembled. The empire that had risen from the mountains, crafted by the hands of countless ancestors, faced a reckoning written in the stars and whispered by the earth itself. In the valleys and highlands, life continued its slow, sacred rhythm. Fields blossomed with maize and potatoes. Llamas grazed on terraced slopes. Children's laughter echoed through stone courtyards. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet tension hummed, like the low note of a drum calling to something unseen. The first winds of change had come to the empire of the Inca, and with them, the fragile threads of a world on the brink of transformation. The empire once moved like a single breath, slow and eternal, rising and falling in harmony with the sun. But now, the breath caught, the air shifted, and along the golden spine of the Andes, the Inca world began to splinter. It did not begin with fire or war, but with absence. Huayna Capac, sovereign of 1,000 valleys and sacred lakes, the man whose shadow stretched from the Pacific coast to the edge of the Amazon, fell silent. In the north, where the empire had reached its furthest grasp, sickness had swept like a ghost through the cities, and with it, the Inca himself was taken, not on the battlefield, not by betrayal, but by something far stranger, something without a face. They say he died near Quito, his body wrapped in royal cloth, his spirit rising into the sky where the ancestors dwell. But even in death, he left behind not one heir, but two. Two sons. And in their jewel glow, the empire found not light, but shadow. Atahualpa, born of a northern mother, fierce and commanding, beloved by the armies. Huascar, born of Cusco, first son of ceremony and tradition, heir to the heart of empire. The sun had always been one, golden and indivisible. But now it seemed to split, casting twin lights upon the earth, each with its own truth, each with its own claim. The roads of the Inca, once veins of unity, now pulsed with rumors, divisions, silent loyalties. Runners carried not just messages, but fear that the sacred order, so long preserved, had been broken. The priests looked to the heavens and saw signs they could not read. The stars shifted. The constellations blinked like watchful eyes. The gods, once clear in their will, had fallen to silence. What followed was not merely a war for power. It was a sundering of the soul. The armies of Huascar marched from Cusco, banners of gold and red fluttering in the mountain wind. He claimed to speak for tradition, for the temples and the sacred rites, for the sun itself. But Atahualpa, far in the north, rallied the warriors who had known him in victory, who had seen his strength on the field and his clarity in command. His power was not in temples, but in the loyalty of those who marched with him. Brother rose against brother. Towns were burned, fields left fallow, idols shattered. The sacred reciprocity, the Aini that had bound all things together, was broken. Where once the people gave and received in harmony, now they hid, they hoarded, they feared. And the empire, which had taken generations to build, began to unravel in a single breath. The war was long, brutal, and without mercy. No valley was untouched, the very roads wept. In time, Atahualpa emerged victorious, his brother captured, his rivals scattered. The north rejoiced in triumph, and the emperor-to-be began his journey south, toward Cusco, toward the throne that waited in quiet judgment. But even then, as he marched beneath the mountain gods, another shadow moved behind the hills, unseen, unimagined. From the sea, strange sails had unfurled. Pale-faced men rode beasts unknown to Andean eyes. They came with thunder in their hands and hunger in their hearts. Their names, though not yet spoken across the valleys, would soon echo like a curse. Pizarro, Spain, conquest. Atahualpa, crowned by war and blood, stood upon the threshold of rule. But he was already standing in a world that had begun to vanish beneath his feet. The fracture had already done its work. The empire was no longer one breath, one path. It had divided, and through that crack, destiny began to fall like rain. In the highlands where clouds nestle among peaks like drifting ghosts, the stone temples still echoed with the songs of the ancestors. And yet, something unnatural stirred. The air, always thin and sharp with altitude, now carried an edge not made of ice, but of iron. Far to the north, in the lands the Inca had only recently bound in gold and fear, a whisper arrived. Not from the gods, nor from the spirits of the mountains, but from the mouths of trembling villagers and stunned warriors. The whisper had a name: Francisco Pizarro. He came not as a king or priest, not with gifts or offerings, but as a hunter. His ships had slashed across the sea like knives, bearing men hardened by greed, conquest, and the bitter memory of distant crusades. They stepped onto the sand, not with reverence, but with a hunger forged in other empires. Empires where gods bled and gold spoke louder than prayers. The Spaniards saw not temples, but treasure. Not spirits, but savages. Not a world, but a prize. And yet for all their fire and steel they were few. Their armor gleamed in the sun like second skins, and their horses, monstrous, thunderous beasts unknown to Andean life, made even brave warriors hesitate. But they were only a handful. The Inca numbered in the millions, and still, destiny bent like a reed toward the foreign wind. When Atahualpa heard of their arrival, he was in Cajamarca, a northern city still draped in the blood and dust of civil war. He had just conquered his brother, Huasca. His armies were strong, his power absolute. He did not fear the strangers, he summoned them instead. In his mind, this was but a formality, a gesture of dominion. Foreigners had come before. They were greeted, fed, sent home with gifts and stories. The empire was eternal. It absorbed all who approached it. But this was not a time of absorption. It was a time of fracture. The city of Cajamarca was shaped like a bowl, nestled among brown hills, surrounded by silence. Into this silence rode Pizarro, not as a guest, but as a spider into the center of a web. His men brought cannon and crossbow, sword and spark. They had been taught that courage was domination and that salvation could ride beside slaughter. And Atahualpa came too, not with weapons, but with ceremony. He arrived borne on a golden litter, garlanded in feathers and sun symbols, his body radiant with the divine. Around him marched thousands, not as soldiers, but as witnesses to imperial grace. Music played, dancers spun, priests chanted in Quechua beneath the thinning sky. It was not a meeting of equals, it was a ritual, a reaffirmation of the order of the world. But Pizarro had brought no understanding of ritual. He saw only opportunity. The two worlds collided not in war, but in misunderstanding, as deadly as any spear. The Inca extended peace. The Spaniards demanded surrender. The priest Valverde raised a Bible and called on Atahualpa to accept Christ and King. The Inca, confused, took the book, turned its pages, and cast it aside when it did not speak. And with that gesture, quiet, almost trivial, the spell shattered. The cannons roared, the horses charged. Steel met flesh, blood baptized the plaza. Thousands fell, unarmed, bewildered, their songs cut short. In the space of an afternoon, an emperor became a prisoner, and an empire gasped in disbelief. Atahualpa, child of the sun, was taken by men who had never seen his mountains, never felt the breath of Inti upon their skin. They bound him in chains of foreign iron, and though his body remained alive, something eternal began to die. For when steel touched stone, something sacred broke, and it would not be mended in this world. There, in a room no larger than a storehouse, the sun sat in chains. Atahualpa, Sapa Inca, son of Inti, ruler of 4 quarters. Now watched the sky through slits of stone. The wind still whispered through the mountains beyond Cajamarca, but it no longer bowed to his presence. The earth, once his silent companion, had grown cold beneath him. He had been captured not by warriors in open combat, but by treachery cloaked in ritual. And now, the divine thread that tied the emperor to the cosmos frayed in the hands of men who did not understand its weave. Pizarro paced outside like a farmer before harvest. He had taken the body of the empire, but not yet its spirit. For the Inca, the world was made of balance, Aini, the sacred reciprocity between all things. Man and mountain, god and maze, emperor and people. Even now in captivity, Atahualpa reached for balance. He made an offer not of surrender, but of exchange. He raised his bound hands and gestured to the blank walls around him. In the language of Quechua, he spoke what would become a legend. He promised to fill the room with gold, not once, but once to the height of his outstretched hand, and twice with silver. He would summon from across the empire statues and goblets, necklaces and ceremonial discs, the adornments of temples and dead kings. From Cusco, from Pachacamac, from the valleys and sacred lakes, the wealth of the Andes would pour into Cajamarca, not as tribute, but as ransom. It was not gold he offered, truly. It was divinity, the breath of gods cast in metal. To the Inca, gold was not currency. It was the sweat of the sun, silver, the tears of the moon. Their radiance held sacred purpose. They cloaked the mummies of ancestors, gilded the temples, and reflected light during solstice ceremonies that kept the universe in order. To melt these relics was an act of cosmic desecration, but to save the Sapa Inca, the living axis of all things, the people complied. From every corner of Tawantinsuyu, runners moved like veins of purpose. In towns and temples, artisans wept as they gave up their life's work. In Cusco, the great golden effigy of Inti was taken down from Coricancha, the temple of the sun, and broken apart. Each piece that arrived in Cajamarca was not merely gold. It was a sacrifice. Within weeks, the room began to fill. A fireless gleam grew in the shadows. Pizarro and his men, once hardened by hunger and uncertainty, now bathed in dreams of endless riches. The Spaniards could not comprehend the sacred weight of what they were dismantling. They saw only metal. They counted chalices. They stacked plates. They catalogued figures of birds, jaguars, and priests. Each object carried the spirit of a people, but in the conquistadors' hands it was melted, recast, divided. They boiled gods down to bullion. Atahualpa watched it all unfold with growing unease. He had given them what they asked. The room, once barren, now gleamed like a solar flare. He had kept his word. as an emperor, as a god, but he began to understand that these men had no word to keep, no sacred bond, no aini. They had crossed the sea not for diplomacy, but for dominion, and now they debated his fate. Some feared the people would rise if he lived. Others whispered of prophecies, that he could call upon the sun to strike them down or summon legions from the jungles. A captive god, they reasoned, was still a god, and gods, in foreign tongues, were dangerous. In the end, Pizarro, the spider at the center of this widening web, made his decision. The ransom was taken, and the Inca was sentenced. In a final gesture of cruelty disguised as mercy, they offered baptism, the erasure of his gods and identity, in exchange for strangulation rather than fire. Atahualpa, perhaps seeking one final balance, agreed. They called him Francisco, a name that tasted foreign even in death. And then, beneath the same sky that once crowned him divine, the last sovereign of an undivided empire was executed. The sun did not rise differently the next day, but something had dimmed in its light. The empire had lost its heart, and yet for a moment it still breathed. When Atahualpa was strangled in Cajamarca, the sun did not vanish from the sky, and the mountains did not crumble into dust. The people still planted. The priests still chanted. The sacred terraces held their green silence. But deep beneath it all, in the stones, in the bones, in the wind that coiled down from Sacsayhuaman, a fracture widened. The Sapa Inca was dead. And though another was hastily crowned, Tupac Hualpa, a puppet emperor chosen to ease the peace, the threads had already begun to unravel. The Spaniards, few in number but swollen with confidence and hunger, now turned their eyes to the beating core of the empire. Cusco, the sacred city, the navel of the world. From every direction, the empire's 4 great roads led here. Chinchaysuyu from the north, Colasuyu from the south, Antisuyu from the jungles of the east, and Kuntisuyu from the western coast, all bled into the stone streets of Cusco like veins into a heart. And now, along one of those veins, foreign hooves rode. Pizarro and his conquistadors moved cautiously, though the path had been cleared. The people, confused by the death of one god and the arrival of another, did not yet rise. The messengers of rebellion had not yet reached the outer provinces. But the silence was not peace, it was grief, it was waiting. Cusco sat surrounded by mountains like a crown cradled in stone. Its temples gleamed even through mist, the great fortress of Sacsayhuaman, with walls like zigzagging lightning, loomed above, not just as a military bastion, but as a divine guardian. And within the city, echoes still lingered of a golden age. It was here that Pachacuti, the builder king, had envisioned a world reborn in harmony. The stones of Cusco laid not only with mortar, but with meaning. Each block fit without blade or dust between them, as though placed by the hand of time itself. Each plaza echoed with ceremony. Each street aligned with starlight. This was not merely a capital. It was the center of the world, and now it opened its gates to strangers. The Spaniards entered not with humility, but with calculation. Their swords gleamed beside gold. Their eyes scanned every surface for wealth, every altar for plunder. Their footsteps rang across the sacred stones, and as they walked, the people watched from windows, doorways, terraces, silent as carved figures. They did not scream, they did not flee. They remembered the days when the sun touched this city directly. When Inti's golden disk sat above the Coricancha, and the Inca, part man, part god, led dances that mimicked the stars. Now, smoke drifted where incense once rose. In the weeks that followed, Cusco was not burned, not yet. But it was changed. The gold was stripped from the temples. The idols were broken or melted, the mummies of the kings. once paraded during festivals, dressed and fed as living ancestors, were taken, desecrated, or lost. The four roads still met in Cusco, but they no longer carried the weight of purpose. Instead, they carried confusion, resistance, and the beginnings of rebellion. In remote valleys and highland villages, rumors began to kindle like coals in the wind. The Sapa Inca was gone, yes, but the soul of the empire had not yet surrendered. The earth still held memory. The stones still sang. Among the nobility and priests who survived, some clung to hope. Among the people, rage gathered like a storm, and among the Spaniards, complacency spread like rot. They thought the city had fallen. But Cusco does not fall in a single day. It endures slowly, like ice that cracks from within. So the conquerors feasted. They claimed palaces. They renamed the temples. They sent word back to Spain. The empire was theirs. And far away in a secret place, hidden among the clouds and guarded by jungle, a spark waited to become flame. For the story of the Inca would not end with Cusco's fall. It would bend, scatter, resist, and rise. There are empires of stone and there are empires of memory. When Cusco fell to steel and greed, when its temples were stripped and its gods renamed, many believed the sun had set forever on the house of Inti. But in the folds of the Andes, where the clouds rest like sleeping serpents and the jungle thickens into silence, a different empire began to take root. Not in marble, nor in gold, but in resistance. This was Vilcabamba, the last breath of the Inca. Not a city, but a sanctuary. Not a capital, but a whisper. Here the mountains closed like ribs around a hidden heart. Here the people who would not kneel, the generals, the priests, the loyal bloodline, fled with their wounded god and their crumbling songs. They carried what they could: ritual, memory, fire. And at the center of it stood a boy, the youngest brother of the bloodline, crowned not in splendor, but in secrecy. Manco Inca Yupanqui. Once a token ruler appointed by Pizarro himself, Manco had watched as the Spaniards turned Cusco into a shell of its former self. He had bowed when they asked, played the part, offered gifts, but within him, something ancient refused to die. He escaped in the night, through hidden paths, across sacred rivers, beneath the cloak of Koiluariti, the star snow. He did not flee to disappear, he fled to ignite. From Vilcabamba, the mountains became allies. Messengers moved like shadows, rekindling loyalties in the sacred valleys. Old warriors came down from the stone terraces. Farmers buried their sickles and unearthed spears. And in the spring of 1536, the fire was lit. Manco Inca returned not with tribute, but with vengeance. He laid siege to Cusco. For 10 months, the sacred city was surrounded. The very stones that once held festivals of peace now watched the dance of war. Arrows flew from the rooftops. Slings cracked like thunder in the narrow streets. The Spaniards, caught in their illusion of conquest, were cornered. From the heights of Sacsayhuaman, Inca warriors rained stone and fire upon the invaders. Smoke curled into the sky, a ghost of the old gods, but fate is a slow and merciless river. Despite the ferocity, the siege could not hold. Spanish reinforcements cut through the highlands. Horses thundered down paths never meant for hooves. Guns cracked open the silence like splitting bark. Disease followed where armies could not. Manco withdrew. He disappeared back into the mountains, back to Vilcabamba, not as a king of conquest, but as a king of the ashes. And so, the Neo-Inca state was born, not in triumph, but in defiance. For nearly 4 decades it endured. Hidden in the folds of the Andes, the last sons of the empire, Manco, then his sons Sairi Tupac, Titu Cusi, and finally Tupac Amaru, ruled a flickering shadow of what had once been eternal. Here, rites continued in whispers. Priests lit fires at dawn. The solstice was still honored. The mummies of ancestors were kept fed and clothed. Though the gold was gone, the soul of the Inca still moved through jungle fog and prayer. Spanish chroniclers called it rebellion. But for those who remained loyal to the old world, it was survival. It was breath. It was proof that the empire was not yet extinguished, only transformed. Time passed like mist curling through the valleys. And then, in 1572, under a new Spanish viceroy eager to silence the past, the final blow came. Soldiers found the hidden paths to Vilcabamba. They marched not just with weapons, but with an intent to erase. Temples were razed, manuscripts burned. The jungle, ever patient, bore witness to blood again. And there, in that sacred stronghold, Tupac Amaru, the last Inca, was captured. They marched him back through the empire his ancestors had ruled, not as a sovereign, but as a warning. In Cusco, the city that once crowned gods, he was led to the plaza in chains. The crowds gathered, silent, unmoving, faces like carved masks. Before he was beheaded, he looked to the sky. No cry, no plea, only a glance toward the sun as if to say, "I return to where we all began." And so ended the final flame of resistance. But not the story, not the meaning. For the fire at Vilcabamba was never just about war. It was about the refusal to forget, the refusal to let sacred memory be turned to dust. And though the empire's stones were shattered, its spirit retreated into rivers, into cornfields, into lullabies whispered to children beneath thatched roofs. Even now, the jungle hides ruins not yet named. Even now, Quechua tongues carry the rhythms of a time when men were gods, and gods were kin to stars. Even now, the sun rises over the Andes, just as it did before the ships came. And sometimes, in the stillness of dawn, you can hear it, a drumbeat beneath the moss, a hymn buried in vines, the echo of an empire that never truly vanished. The empire had fallen, its last sovereign beheaded, its temples desecrated, and its roads conquered. Yet the story did not end in the silence of defeat. Instead, it entered a new realm, a place not of stone or gold, but of memory, spirit, and breath. The Inca lived on, not as rulers crowned in splendor, but as whispers in the mountains, echoes in the rivers, and shadows beneath the stars. Their legacy was not buried beneath the conquistadors' boots. It was woven into the very fabric of the Andes. For centuries, the bones of the empire rested beneath the soil, and with them, a truth profound and enduring. History is never merely what is recorded on parchment or displayed in palaces. It is the memory held in the body, the language spoken beneath the breath, and the songs sung by the wind. The Quechua people, descendants of the great empire, carried forward a living tradition. Their language, as vibrant and unyielding as the mountain peaks, passed down stories of Pachacuti's vision, of Manco's rebellion, and of Tupac Amaru's sacrifice. These were not mere tales, but hymns of identity, vessels of resilience. Across the centuries, Inca cosmology seeped into daily life. The earth, or Pachamama, was still revered as mother, giver of life, keeper of balance. Farmers continued to plant with the cycles of the moon and the sun, offering chala, sacred libations, to honor the unseen forces. In remote villages, the rhythms of the past and present danced together. Children learned the old prayers as naturally as the new tongues imposed by conquerors. Festivals blended Inca and Christian rites, weaving a tapestry of resistance and adaptation. The mummy cult, once the spine of political power, transformed too. Mummified ancestors remained central to spiritual life. Families continued to care for these relics, dressing them, feeding them, inviting them to festivals. A reminder that death was but a doorway to a different form of presence. Through centuries of colonization, exploitation, and erasure, the Inca spirit endured not through monuments, but through memory and practice. The conquistadors sought to crush the soul of the empire, but they could not erase what lay deep in the bones. In the late 18th century, whispers of rebellion stirred once more. The figure of Tupac Amaru II rose from the past to ignite the present. Claiming descent from the last Inca ruler, he led a revolt against Spanish oppression, a testament to how the memory of empire lived on, fierce and unyielding. Though his rebellion was ultimately crushed, his name became a symbol, an emblem of indigenous resistance across centuries. In modern times, the story of the Inca is neither lost nor static. Archaeologists uncover stone walls that refuse to crumble, golden artifacts that catch the light of dawn, and petroglyphs that hum with ancient wisdom. But these are only fragments, shards of a larger, living mosaic. The greater monument is the people themselves. Their languages, rituals, and knowledge are rivers flowing through time, carrying the sacred geometry of a civilization that once held the sun in its hands. And so, as night deepens and the stars emerge above the Andes, it is fitting to remember the story of the Inca is not confined to pages or museums. It lives in the breath of the earth, the pulse of the mountains, and the hearts of those who listen. The empire may have fallen, but its memory endures. The Inca did not build at random. They did not raise stone for shelter alone. Every line they etched into the mountainside, every terrace carved from the rock, every thread woven into a tunic. It all spoke a language older than conquest, older even than kings. It was the language of the cosmos. To walk through an Inca city was not merely to walk through space. It was to step through time, to pass through stories laid out like stars in a dark sky. Their cities were not separate from the heavens. They mirrored them, as above, so below. And at the heart of this cosmic map was Cusco, the navel of the world. Not a metaphor, but a design. Cusco was laid out in the form of a puma, sacred animal of strength and transformation. Its streets were not laid haphazardly, but flowed like veins through the living body of the city. The head of the puma was Sacsayhuaman, the mighty fortress that crowned the city, its teeth made of massive, zigzagging stones. The body extended downward, where the heart pulsed with ritual and gathering. The tail curved toward the sacred river, the Huatanay, where offerings were cast into the water like words into the silence of the gods. But the puma was only one layer. Beneath this animal design stretched another lattice, the invisible lines of the sex system. 41 lines radiated outward from the Coricancha, the temple of the sun, like spokes on a golden wheel. Along these lines were hundreds of huacas, sacred sites, stones, springs, trees, and shrines, each one tied to a deity, a myth, a memory. These were not merely markers. They were waypoints in a divine conversation between humans and the gods. The landscape itself was alive. It held memory. It breathed. The mountains, the Apus, were gods with names, moods, and stories. Offerings were made to them, songs sung at their feet. The valleys between them were seen not as voids, but as sacred spaces of connection, like the folds of a great cosmic cloth. The Inca world was stitched together by geometry, not just in stonework, but in meaning. They mastered the art of the trapezoid, a shape found throughout their architecture, doors, windows, niches. The trapezoid, they believed, withstood the shaking of Pachamama. Earthquakes would tremble, but the trapezoid held. It was a shape of balance and humility. Stone met stone with such precision that no mortar was needed. Each piece fit into the next as though remembering a shared origin. The walls breathed with the land. They were not imposed, they belonged. Even the terraces that graced the mountainsides were more than agriculture. They were gradients of microclimates carefully designed to test what would grow where. In Moray, the circular terraces descended into the earth like an eye, a spiral a wound, or perhaps a sacred clock, measuring not hours, but seasons, growth, time itself. To the Inca, mathematics was not separate from the sacred. Their counting systems, their quipu, knotted cords of various colors and positions, recorded not only tributes and harvests, but possibly poems, genealogies, and prayers. Each knot was a word, each color a meaning, each distance a pause in the song. The quipu remains a mystery, like the stars. And perhaps that is fitting, for the Inca saw time not as a straight line, but as a cycle, a great spiral. Just as the Milky Way, the Mayu, curved above them in the sky, so did life curve upon the earth. Birth led to death, death to return. Seeds buried became harvests. Ancestors lived on in bone, in story, in shadow. In this geometry, nothing was wasted. Not grief, not labor, not time. They knew that the sun moved in patterns, that solstices mattered, that the light itself spoke. In Machu Picchu, on the day of the solstice, the rising sun shines through the temple of the sun and lights a precise stone within. A moment not accidental. A moment scripted into stone centuries before. Their sacred architecture was not built to last. It was built to align, with stars, with seasons, with the breath of the divine. Even in ruin, this geometry persists. The Spanish tore down many temples, built churches atop foundations they could not understand. Yet the old stones remain, unmoved by time, unshaken by centuries. Walk through Ollantaytambo, through the temples of Pisac, and you feel it. The world is not random. There is order, deeper than memory. A rhythm beneath the dust, and in this rhythm the Inca still speak, through stone, through shadow, through silence. Let the world forget gold and empire and war. Those were passing things, but the patterns the Inca left, in soil, in sky, in spirit, those remain. They are not relics, they are invitations, to see the world not as conquered ground, but as sacred design. To trace, once again, the lines between stars and stones. To remember that everything, yes, everything, is connected. And to live, perhaps, not as masters of the earth, but as readers of its sacred script. Every empire must descend. It is not a punishment, nor a failure, but a turning, a necessary spiral in the cosmic pattern. For the Inca, the descent came not as a sudden fall, but as a long, aching hush, like the silence after a song once sung by the sun. The world that once rose with the will of Pachacuti now began to bow beneath the shadow of foreign gods, foreign weapons, and foreign tongues. The land remembered. But the light had shifted. The descent was not just of stone and blood. It was a descent of spirit, into darkness, into confusion, into the realm of the forgotten. In Inca cosmology, the underworld was called Ukupacha, the inner world, the deep place beneath the surface of the earth. It was not a realm of torment, but of gestation, a place of seeds, of silence, of waiting. And that is where the empire went, after the swords of Spain carved open the great mountain roads, after the idols of gold were stripped from their temples, after the royal mummies were burned, their ash cast into rivers that no longer recognized their names. The soul of the Inca retreated. It went inward, like a heartbeat moving beneath a wound. The Spaniards had won the war on the surface, but the Incas were not made of surface alone. They were mountain and marrow, root and river. And so they did what all sacred things do when pressed to the brink. They descended. In the quiet places, deep within the Shulpa, funerary towers built to honor the dead, candles still flickered. Offerings were still left. Quiet prayers, spoken in Quechua, passed between cracked stone and whispered through the teeth of the wind. In Vilcabamba, the last refuge of the empire, the jungle closed around the final echo of resistance. There, the last breath of royal blood burned like an ember, hidden beneath green canopies and distant thunder. But even Vilcabamba fell, and with it, the empire's last city vanished into moss. But cities are not the only places where souls reside. The Inca descent continued, not in defeat, but in becoming. The people who once built empires now became wanderers, farmers, servants, and spirits. Their rituals disguised as festivals, their gods renamed as saints, their temples buried, but their steps unchanged. This was the time of darkness, but not death. The darkness of a seed, a sleeping jaguar beneath the earth, a silence too sacred to break. And in this underworld, stories changed shape, legends grew teeth, heroes became myths. The last Sapa Inca, Tupac Amaru, became not just a man, but a shadow who walked the borders of the living and the dead. In him, the spirit of the empire refused to die. His final words, though lost to history, still ripple through stone, a resistance too vast for paper to contain. The Spaniards, in their chronicles, recorded victories, but they could not read what was written in silence. They did not know that 1,000 sacred stones still watched them from the mountains, that the earth beneath their feet held not just bones, but memory, that the quipu, dismissed as primitive knots, might still speak in patterns they had no name for. The Inca knew what the conquerors did not, that descent was not the end. In the Andean worldview, time was not a road that ran forward, but a circle, a pachacuti, a turning of the world. And so, the descent was not a fall from grace, but a necessary passage into the womb of time, into the waiting earth, into the bones of what would be born again. Some say that in the hidden valleys, in the cold breath of the Apus, the ancient ones still walk, that spirits move through the ruins at twilight, that the stones, aligned with sun and star, hum faintly with the memory of what once was, and what may be again. And perhaps it is true, for even the Spaniards could not erase the mountains. Even fire could not destroy the sky. The Inca descent, then, was not the loss of a people. It was their transformation. They became the night sky, scattered and dark, yes, but full of meaning. They became the river, diverted and dammed, but never stopped. They became the silence, vast, unknowable, sacred. And in that silence, the empire waits, not for a return to thrones or crowns, but for something deeper, a remembering, a rising, a return not of conquest, but of connection, where every step taken on the Andes is again a step through time, where the breath of Pachamama fills the lungs of children who have never seen Cusco, but carry its rhythm in their blood, where the old stories are no longer buried beneath foreign stones, but spoken again, as softly as they once were, by firelight in the mountains. So let the descent be honored. Let it be named not as loss, but as sacred passage. The Inca did not die. They went underground, where all true things must go before they rise again. The empire had fallen, but not the fire, not the pulse in the mountains, not the hush in the ravines where sacred winds still stirred. For though the Spanish flag flew over Cusco and churches stood where temples once glowed with gold, the Andes had not been conquered. They had been wounded, yes, pierced and shaken, but never tamed. And within those wounds, the fire of resistance took root. Not loud, not in armies marching in daylight, but in the quiet acts, the coded words, the gathering in shadowed groves, in the whispering of prayers in Quechua, in the weaving of ancient symbols into cloth, in songs that remembered when the sky had a different name. The Inca world had become a labyrinth, a twisting of old paths and new dangers, of surface submission and subterranean defiance. It was no longer a kingdom of one throne. Now it was 100 secret altars, 1,000 unseen rebellions, a people who bent like the reed, only to rise again when the wind passed. In the southern valleys, families told stories forbidden by law. They spoke of Pachacuti, the earth shaper, who would one day return, of Inti, the sun, who saw everything, even through Spanish armor, of the last Inca kings whose bodies had vanished into the mist, but whose spirits still walked among the ice-crusted peaks. They remembered, and in remembering, they resisted. Some ran, into the jungles, into the caves, into the deep Andean folds that the conquerors feared to enter. There, in the thickets and fog, resistance lived on in exiles. They built new villages of stone and thatch, unreachable by the high-born soldiers who stumbled over their own ambitions. And some stayed, in plain sight, wearing Spanish clothes, speaking Spanish words, but keeping the old gods beneath their breath. Women wove chacana crosses and stepped carefully on seke paths that no longer had names. Men tended maize on terraces, first carved by ancestors whose bones had turned to dust, but not to silence. Even the festivals of the new order became double-faced. The Feast of St. John, celebrated with drums and fire, was also the solstice, the return of the sun. The Virgin of the Candlemas became Pachamama in new robes. Saints were crowned in gold that once belonged to gods. They called it syncretism, but it was something deeper, a disguise, a divine misdirection the fire burned beneath. In Vilcabamba, the final outpost of the royal bloodline, the dream of sovereignty still shimmered, like heat above a highland stone. There, the final Incas defied the Spanish crown for 4 decades. They struck from hidden ridges. They vanished into trees. They negotiated and fled, signed treaties and broke them, prayed and fought again and again. And in 1572, when Tupac Amaru, the last Inca king, was captured, paraded through Cusco, and beheaded before the crowds, the Spanish thought it was finished. But a flame cannot behead its smoke. Tupac Amaru's death echoed across time, not as an ending, but as a signal. The labyrinth deepened. The fire did not die. 2 centuries later, another man would take up his name. Tupac Amaru II, descendant of the Inca, leader of a great rebellion that shook the Spanish crown to its core. His uprising in 1780 lit the Andes once more with fire and fury. He spoke of justice, of memory, of empire reclaimed. And though he too was captured, his limbs torn apart by horses, his name, that name, could not be erased. It became a prayer again, a prophecy, a promise. For in every valley and village, there remained those who did not forget. Grandmothers who passed on the songs, children who learned the shape of ancient words on their tongues, weavers who wove not only colors, but cosmos. The labyrinth lived in them. Each resistance was small. A ritual survived, a story retold, a feast reclaimed. But together they formed a map, a secret cartography of the soul. And across that map, fires flickered. Even the earth conspired. Earthquakes shook Spanish churches, revealing Inca walls beneath, stronger, older, unmarred. The conquerors built, but the ground did not forget. It shifted, it cracked, it unveiled. The temples of the past returned, stone by stone, from beneath the whitewashed paint of history. And still, the fire burned. Not in war, but in remembrance. Not in armies, but in ancestors. Even now, centuries later, it smolders in the Andean winds, in the rituals of Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun. In the stones of Sacsayhuaman, where tourists walk but do not always hear the heartbeat. In the Quechua tongue, spoken still, unbroken, humming with the rhythm of empire beneath empire. The Inca labyrinth is not a ruin, it is a riddle, and to enter it, truly enter it, is not to find a way out, but a way in. Into the heart of a people who refused to vanish, who turned loss into lineage, who carried a sun on their backs through centuries of shadow. So let the fires of the Andes be honored. Let them be tended, softly, slowly. They are not ashes, they are embers. And when the time comes, they will rise again. Not in vengeance, but in vision. Not to rebuild the empire of stone, but to reawaken the empire of memory. Long after the voices had faded from the palaces, long after the banners of Tawantinsuyu had been trampled into foreign soil, the roads remained. They stretched across the Andes like veins beneath an ancient skin, pulsing, waiting, remembering. The Capac Ñan, the royal road, still traced its 1,000-mile breadth through mountains and cloud forests, desert and ice. Stones fitted with divine precision still kissed the feet of pilgrims and wanderers. And though the emperors were gone and the messengers lay silent, the path itself had not forgotten. It carried more than footsteps. It carried ghosts. The Incas believed that death was not an ending, but a crossing. That the soul walked on into other realms, across bridges unseen by the living eye. And in that sacred logic, the roads they built were not just physical. They were spiritual threads. To walk them was to remember. To walk them was to awaken. The Shaski, those swift-footed runners who once carried messages and meaning between the corners of the empire, no longer sprinted across the high passes. But in the hush of dawn, in the thin places between world and world, some still heard footsteps on the stone. Light, urgent, eternal. Even the Spaniards, for all their power, feared the roadways. They feared how they stretched too far, too perfectly, how they led to places no map recorded, how the people followed them still, whispering as they went. There were tales of those who vanished on the Capac Ñan, swallowed not by wild beasts, but by memory, drawn into the road itself, into the curvature of time. There were places where the wind always blew in one direction, where llamas would not tread, where the stars aligned too neatly with the stones below. These were the ghost roads, not haunted by the vengeful, but by the faithful, by those who had walked before and walked still. Ancestors, warriors, weavers of fate. They walked beside the living, not to frighten, but to remind, to teach, to carry. The Incas had called their dead by name. They had dressed them, consulted them, shared meals with them. Death to them was no barrier, only another form of presence, and so the roads became shrines, not of grief, but of guidance. In remote passes, cairns still rise, stones left not only as markers, but as offerings. Travelers mutter words in Quechua, hoping the spirits of the path will grant safe passage. Coca leaves are scattered, not for luck, but for alignment, a gesture to the guardians who watch without eyes. There are stories of a Sapa Inca who once walked his own death road, accompanied by warriors, priests, servants, and the whisper of the future. It is said that when he reached the summit, the sun stood still, that the air turned gold, that the path disappeared behind him, consumed by the sky. No bones were ever found, only silence. And in that silence, belief. The ghost roads were not made for escape, nor for conquest. They were made to bind, to connect temple to field, lake to peak, heaven to earth. And now, in this long twilight after empire, they connect memory to movement. To walk them is to trace the muscle of a world that still breathes. To walk them is to speak without sound. There are women in the high villages who still carry offerings in woven cloths, offerings not to statues, but to the road itself. They place potatoes, maize, dried flowers along the old stones. They do not speak. They only hum, a tune older than empire, older than language. The road listens. In certain places, the moss grows in patterns. In others, no moss grows at all. The dead choose where they linger. The children of the Andes are taught to greet the road. Before they place their foot upon it, they lower their heads. Not out of fear, but reverence. For the stones beneath their souls once bore the steps of gods, and perhaps still do. For some say that the Inca kings never died, that they walk the Hapak Nyan forever, clad in light, unseen by those who forget, but clear to those who remember. They say Manco Inca's ghost roams Vilcabamba's green shadows, watching over the exiled cities. They say Pachacuti's echo rises in the earthquakes that still ripple through Cusco. Whether legend or truth, the road continues. Even now, archaeologists clear the brush and find it. Still solid, still singing. Even now, birds trace its route in the sky, as if pulled by some memory of alignment. Even now, the wind hums a rhythm only the mountains understand. And in every step taken upon those stones, the soul of the Inca moves again. Not backward, but forward. Not toward empire reborn, but toward connection reclaimed. So walk gently, speak softly, leave an offering, even if only your breath. The road remembers, the dead walk still, and in their walking they keep the empire alive. Not in walls or crowns, but in the rhythm of footsteps, the silence between stones, the mystery of the path that always leads home. Beneath the new cathedrals of stone and bell, beneath the sermons shouted in a foreign tongue, beneath the silver gleam of Spanish armor, she slept. Pachamama, Mother Earth, the great giver, the endless receiver, the silent goddess of seed and womb, of mountain and root. The Incas had never carved her in gold. She needed no temple walls. She was the temple. She lived in the curve of the valley, in the pulse of the volcano, in the murmur of the river that knew no master. Every maize stalk that rose from the black soil was her child. Every earthquake was her shifting dream. But when the conquerors came, she was buried, buried beneath flags and crosses, buried beneath civilization, buried in the silent tears of those who once knelt before her with coca leaves in hand, whispering thanks before each harvest. They said she was superstition. They said she was idolatry. They said she was dead, but gods do not die. They descend. She descended into the bones of the Andes, the slow, ancient spiral where forgotten deities go not to perish, but to listen. She listened to the cries of her people, to the rustle of broken rituals, to the prayers smuggled beneath rosaries whispered not to saints, but to soil. And she waited. The Incas had once given her everything, the blood of llamas, the breath of chicha, the first fruit from every harvest. Before they built, they asked her. Before they buried their dead, they touched her skin. The earth was not a place to conquer. It was a being to court, to honor, to adore. In her womb were the bones of ancestors, in her breast the veins of water, in her breath the wind that knew the names of every peak. But now the offerings had changed. She was given coins instead of coca, concrete instead of corn. Her slopes were carved by hunger, not devotion. Her rivers were chained, her skies scarred with smoke. Still, she endured, for there were some, always, who remembered. In the high pastures, the Yakaks, the old knowledge keepers, still laid offerings before her, hidden in caves. They shaped circles of stones, lit fires of eucalyptus, and sang the ancient chants. Not for show, not for history, but for balance. Aini, they whispered. Reciprocity. You give, you receive, you take, you thank. This was the law of Pachamama. Older than empire, older than conquest, older than time. And in breaking this law, the world tilted. Storms came where there were none. Fields dried, mountains wept stones. She was not punishing, she was reminding, she was breathing, and that breath, faint as it had become, still lived in the smallest places. In a child planting potatoes beside her grandmother. In the quiet way a man paused to touch the earth before a long journey. In the way the wind sometimes stopped and everything listened. There were other gods too, forgotten but not gone. Ilapa, the god of thunder, who once danced in the sky with sling and club, now hidden behind the saints of rain. Mama Quila, the moon mother, glowing quietly in the night, her stories woven into lullabies no priest could erase. Viracocha, the great creator, the one who rose from Lake Titicaca and shaped the world with tears and light, now unnamed, but still alive in myth, in echo, in yearning. They had not vanished. They had become silence. And yet silence, too, is a kind of power. It seeps into roots, it shapes dreams, it waits. The forgotten gods did not cry out for vengeance, they waited for remembrance. For the moment, a seed touches soil and is not just planted, but blessed. For the hand that stops harvesting and begins offering. In the great story of the Andes, nothing is ever truly lost, only hidden, only veiled. And now, in the softening hours of time, the veils begin to thin. Festivals return, chants echo once more in the high valleys. The names are whispered, not as rebellion, but as renewal. Pachamama is rising, not with fury, with forgiveness. She receives even now the offerings of those who wounded her. She cradles their children in the same soil. She sends water even to fields that forgot her name. Her love is not conditional. Her memory is not cruel. She waits for the world to remember, and when it does, when even a handful kneel before the earth and offer thanks without expectation, she breathes again. The Inca gods do not need altars. They do not need revival. They are. In the rock, in the flame, in the shadow, in the seed. To walk upon this land is to tread the body of a divine being. To plant is to pray. To eat is to partake of a sacrament older than any creed. So let us bow, not in shame, but in awe. Let us place our palms on the soil and feel it pulse. Let us offer not gold, not silver, not ritual without meaning, but sincerity. A breath, a song, a small stone. The gods will hear. They have always heard, even when forgotten, even when buried, even when named no longer. They are still here, still waiting, still sacred. Deep in the folds of the Andes, where the mountains rise like the spines of ancient beasts, there lies a place where silence lingers longer than anywhere else. Vilcabamba, the last refuge of a dying empire, the cradle of whispered hope, the shadowed heart where the fading light of the Inca burned its final flicker. It was here, in this hidden valley of jagged peaks and mist-clad forests, that the remnants of Tawantinsuyu retreated, not with the clamor of soldiers, but with the quiet determination of those who knew the world was changing beneath their feet. Here, the pulse of an empire slowed, then stuttered, then paused, like a breath held too long. The Spaniards called it the Lost City, but Vilcabamba was never lost to those who believed. It was a sanctuary of memory and resistance, where the last Sapa Inca sought not conquest, but survival. Manco Inca Yupanqui, the warrior king who had fled Cusco when the empire crumbled, made this his home, the final throne upon a throne of stones. The valley held secrets that even the cold hands of colonial power could not seize. Between its waterfalls and emerald canopies, the old gods still murmured. The earth still remembered the footsteps of priests and kings, the rhythm of festivals, the weight of ancestral songs. Vilcabamba was the empire's last breath, fragile, sacred, and fiercely alive. For nearly 4 decades, it stood as a beacon of hope, a living testament to a people who refused to vanish. Here, the Inca laws were whispered in Quechua. The terraces blossomed with maize and potatoes, and the fires of worship glowed beneath the star. But the world beyond Vilcabamba was a storm of change. The Spaniards, relentless and hungry, hunted the shadows. They encroached on the valley's edges, their cannons thundered through the canyons, and their muskets shattered the silence. Still, Vilcabamba endured. A ghost of glory, a flicker in the night. The final siege came not with a roar, but a slow unraveling. The valley's defenders, weary from years of exile, faced starvation and disease. The sacred fires dwindled. The old ways grew faint. When Manco Inca was killed, it was not on a battlefield, but in an ambush. A sudden, silent end to a long, patient resistance. His death was a fracture in the valley's heart, and with it, the spirit of the empire began to fade. Vilcabamba was abandoned. The jungle reclaimed its stones. Vines wove through walls that once echoed with laughter and ceremony. Birds nested in the ruins where kings once walked. And yet, the silence was not empty. It was a silence filled with memory. Each leaf, each drop of rain, each whisper of wind carried the weight of 1,000 stories. The land held the dreams of those who had loved and lost here. The mothers who cradled their children, the warriors who stood watch under the stars, the priests who sang to the mountains. Vilcabamba's silence was the voice of endurance. It told of a people who had danced with gods and lived under the gaze of the sun. It told of empires built and unmade, of blood and stone, of love and loss, carved into the very fabric of the Andes. Today, the ruins stand as a quiet monument, not to conquest or defeat, but to the resilience of spirit, to the refusal to disappear. The jungle's embrace is not erasure, it is protection. And in the hush of that ancient valley where moss softens the edges of broken walls, the empire breathes still. For an empire's last breath is never its last word. It lingers in the wind, it lives in the roots, it whispers in the silence. Vilcabamba's silence is not the end. It is the promise of return. In the quiet corners of Andean villages, beneath the endless sky, there live the keepers of a sacred craft, the weavers, not mere artisans of cloth, but weavers of time, of memory, of fate itself. Their fingers move with a rhythm older than history, pulling threads dyed with earth and sky, dyed with the colors of mountains and rivers, with the stories of a people who survived beyond empire and conquest. Each tapestry is a cosmos, a map not just of land, but of spirit. Here, in patterns of red and black, gold and indigo, are woven the myths of Pachamama, the flight of Inti the sun, and the silent journey of the dead to the other world. Each thread carries a prayer, each knot a lesson. To weave is to remember. To weave is to resist forgetting. These textiles are not simply cloth, they are living archives, folded histories that speak louder than words, that sing when the wind moves through their fibers. The weavers are storytellers without voices, their art a language of symbols. The zigzag of rivers, the stepped terraces of mountain farms, the sacred duality of light and shadow. They carry the legacy of the Quipus, those ancient knotted cords that recorded numbers and stories alike, a secret code of empire now spoken only in the hands of those who listen deeply. In every stitch, the past breathes. They remember the empire's glory, the vast roads threading through valleys and peaks, the cities carved in stone with a precision that still humbles the modern eye. They remember the festivals where the sun was worshipped, and the nights when the stars told stories older than time. But they also remember the fall, the loss, the silence, the exile. And in their weaving, they hold the fragments of those stories, piecing them back together with care, creating something whole from what once was broken. The threads bind past and present, weaving the ancestors into the living moment, reminding each generation that they are part of a continuum, a chain unbroken, a river flowing through time. It is said that when a weaver's work is complete, the tapestry sings with the voices of those who came before, whispering wisdom and warning, love and loss. Through their hands, the empire lives on, not as a monument of stone, but as a vibrant, breathing memory. These are the guardians of heritage, the keepers of identity. In their looms, the heart of the Andes beats steady and sure. And as the sun sets behind the distant peaks, casting a golden light over threads and hands alike, the tapestry of the Inca Empire unfolds again, infinite, eternal, and sacred. In the quiet hours when the world seems to hold its breath, there flows a river of silent tears, not just from those who lived through the fall of empire, but from the earth itself, from the stones, from the air heavy with memory. Loss is a language without words, a shadow that stretches across time. The Inca Empire, vast and vibrant, carved from the bones of mountains and the breath of rivers, was more than stone and gold. It was a pulse, a spirit woven into the land, a delicate balance between human and divine. And when it shattered, when the conquistadors marched through Cusco and the fires burned, something ancient wept. These silent tears seep through cracks in walls, run through the roots of ancient trees, and rise in the fog that curls over the Andes at dawn. They carry stories of mothers who watched their children taken, of warriors who laid down their spears, of priests who saw their gods vanish into shadow. But these tears are not only sorrow, they are also hope. Hope that the future will remember. Hope that the wounds will heal. Hope that what was lost will find a new voice. Time does not erase pain, it transforms it. Like the river that carves stone, loss shapes the landscape of the soul. The descendants of the Inca carry these tears quietly, in the way they hold their traditions, in the songs they sing, in the languages they speak. Quechua still flows like water in the valleys, a living thread to a past that refuses to be forgotten. Even in the face of erasure, identity persists. The tears speak of endurance, of cultures that survive beneath the surface, waiting to rise again like the sun over the mountain peaks. There is a sacredness in grief, a holiness in remembering. For to forget would be to silence the ancestors, to deny the earth its stories, to close the book on a legacy too vast to be contained by conquest. And so the tears flow, not as surrender, but as testimony. Not as defeat, but as a quiet vow. The Inca Empire may have fallen, but it has never truly left. Its spirit is the wind that stirs the tall grasses, the snow that blankets the high passes, the flicker of firelight in a village home. Loss and hope are entwined, like the branches of the ancient quincha, the sacred willow. They remind us that from the depths of despair, new life can grow, that every ending carries a seed of beginning, and that the story, the true story, is never finished. It waits patiently, like the slow dawn over the Andes, for those who will listen, for those who will remember, for those who will carry the silent tears forward, weaving them into the future. There is a place beyond stone and sky, a realm not drawn on any map, yet walked by every soul who has ever borne sorrow. The Inca knew this place well. Uku Pacha, the inner world, the underworld, the world beneath the world. It was not hell, nor a place of punishment. It was mystery. It was the sacred darkness from which all things are born, and to which all must return. The womb of the earth, the silence after the song. In the long shadow of empire's end, the Inca people began their descent, not just into exile or forest, but inward, into grief, into memory, into the sacred depths of Uku Pacha. It was a trial of spirits, not of swords, when the temples crumbled, when the golden icons were melted down, when the old prayers were forbidden. The journey to the underworld began. Each soul carried their own offering, a word remembered, a song half sung, a broken piece of quipu, a story whispered to a child before sleep. The spirits of the fallen kings, of the priests and the builders, of the mothers who sang to the mountains, all gathered in that inner world. They were not gone. They waited, in the folds of time, in the roots of the sacred Apu Mountains, in the quiet corners of the mind. To walk Uku Pacha was not to be lost. It was to be tested. Could a people endure after the fall? Could memory survive without monuments? Could the sacred live on in silence? The Spanish did not understand Uku Pacha. They thought power was only in height, in churches built above temples, in crosses raised above the sun. But the Inca knew differently. They knew that what grows must come from beneath, that power also lies in what is hidden, that the deepest truths are not shouted but whispered, not built but grown. And so they journeyed downward. They held their rituals in secret. They hid their gods in caves and in stories disguised as lullabies. They wore the colors of resistance in woven belts, unrecognized by the new lords. They planted seeds of faith in the hearts of children who would one day remember, even if they could not explain why. Uku Pacha became their refuge, a spiritual trench where culture took shelter, waiting for the storm above to pass. And within that darkness, something extraordinary happened. They did not vanish. They transformed. Like seeds buried deep in winter, their spirit endured. There is a strength in descent, a power in humility. To go down is not to be defeated, it is to prepare. For what lies beneath shall one day rise again. The Inca understood the cyclical nature of all things, that the sun sets not in death but in promise, that the moon wanes to wax, that the corn withers only to bloom again. So too did they understand that the fall of an empire was not the end of a people. It was the beginning of a deeper knowing, a return to the soil, to the source, to the sacred. In caves beneath the Andes, where bats whisper and the breath of the mountain grows cold, there are still shrines untouched by time, offerings of coca leaves, carved stones, tiny golden figures wrapped in faded cloth. These are not relics, they are messages, echoes of a descent that was also a passage, not a collapse, but a cocoon. The trial of spirits was never meant to destroy. It was meant to reveal, to distill the Inca soul into something indestructible. And in the silence of Uku Pacha, in the dark beneath history, that soul still burns, waiting, remembering, becoming. There are flames that burn without light, coals that glow beneath the ash, warm and watchful, biding their time. After the collapse, after the conquest, after the final drumbeat of empire faded into the cold silence of the highlands, something still breathed beneath the ruin. It was not grand anymore. There were no more golden temples, no festivals lit by the fire of 1,000 torches, no emperors draped in sun-dyed cloth. But in the small things, those quiet, deliberate, sacred things, the Inca survived. In woven belts passed down from mother to daughter, patterns told stories no priest could erase. In the rhythm of farming, guided by the stars and the moon, the old knowledge lived. In the kneeling of a man before a stone, whispering thanks to an apu, there pulsed a defiance. We remember. Though the Spanish wore crosses and brought fire and steel, they did not see everything. They could not see the gods hidden in plain sight, the sacred rhythms moving beneath the Christian hymns taught in colonial churches. They did not hear the second voice in the prayers, the one whispered in Quechua, the one that called to the sun and the earth and the wind. It was not resistance in arms, it was resistance in essence. The llama herder on the slope of a cloud-draped mountain, his tunic dyed with sacred indigo, was a living heir to the world they tried to bury. The child singing to the maize as it grew was speaking an incantation older than the invader's language. The midwife, speaking over a newborn's head, was not just welcoming life. She was inviting the ancestors to return through blood and breath. These were not accidents. They were acts of remembrance, cloaked in daily life. And like fire beneath the ash, they burned slow and sure. Even in cities built atop ruins, even as churches rose where temples once stood, the old ways found shadows to live in. They crept into festivals renamed for saints but danced to rhythms meant for the gods. They lived in masks, in music, in the tilt of the head when the sun crossed the sky a certain way. The colonizers believed they had silenced the sun, but the sun had only hidden its face. The Inca had learned a new way to burn, quietly, enduringly. Among the hills of Vilcabamba, where the last Sapa Inca once fled, embers still glowed. There, in the thick jungles, children grew up hearing two histories, the one written in foreign ink and the one carved into memory with sacred breath. The empire had fallen in form, but not in soul. A grandmother's weaving, rich with colors forbidden in colonial garments, told the story of Tawantinsuyu's rise and fall. A thread of gold traced the path of the sacred river, while deep blue marked the morning of the land. They told these stories with their hands, because they could no longer tell them with their mouths. But hands remember. Hands know. And so the fire spread, not in rebellion, not in war, but in inheritance. What could not be carried in arms was carried in hearts. What could not be written was whispered. What could not be taught was lived. And slowly, over generations, the flames beneath the ash began to stir. A revival, not sudden, but steady. Not loud, but real. From the ashes of empire rose not another golden city, but something even more eternal. A people who knew who they were, who still turned their faces to the sun with reverence, who still spoke to mountains as kin, who still held maize not just as food, but as sacred life. The world had changed, but so had the Inca. And that is the truest kind of survival, not to remain the same, but to change without being erased, to bend without breaking, to burn slowly beneath the ash, until the moment comes when the fire rises again. They say the mountain sleeps, but it is not silence that dwells beneath its snow-blanketed spine. It is memory. Memory turned to stone. Memory layered in terraces and bones. Memory rising like mist from the ravines of the Andes. To the Inca, the mountains were not scenery. They were ancestors. Gods carved by time, protectors cloaked in stone and wind. These were the Apus, the sacred mountain spirits, and long after the empire fell, they remained, not just as peaks or myth, but as listeners, witnesses, silent guardians of a people scattered yet not lost. When the priests burned the quipus, when the conquistadors razed the temples, the Apus remembered. Their silence was not absence, it was preservation. The Inca had long believed that the earth was alive, not metaphorically, but wholly, breathing and conscious. And in this belief was their salvation. Because what is buried is not gone, and what is stone can speak, if one knows how to listen. The bones of the Inca did not disappear into the dust. They merged with the mountain. In burial rituals, they were placed upright, facing the horizon, eyes toward the sun's return. In hidden caves and sacred crevices, they were offered to the earth not in grief, but in continuity. They became part of the Andes, part of the body of the world. To walk the high trails today is to walk among the whispers of kings and farmers, weavers and warriors. Their presence is etched into the stone paths that still cling to cliffs, into the steps worn smooth by centuries of pilgrimage. Each footfall is a conversation, each echo a reply. The land itself became archive, a breathing manuscript of empire, not written in ink but in wind, not bound in parchment but in lichen-covered stone. Here, the Shakana, the Incan cross, appears not only in temples but in nature, in the shape of staircases carved into slopes, in the stars as they turn through the sky. It is the symbol of worlds interwoven, the lower world of the ancestors, the middle world of the living, and the upper world of the gods. In the mountains, those worlds meet, and they endure. Even the Spanish in time came to fear the reach of the mountains. Their horses slipped on sacred paths. Their lungs burned in the high altitudes. Their faith faltered where the Apus stood tallest. For here, their god was not the only god. The Inca had built temples aligned not to men, but to the sun. They had carved stones so precisely that even earthquakes dared not unseat them. They had shaped the very bones of the earth into worship. This was not lost. Even centuries later, the stones remain where human hands once placed them. The terraces still climb, green and ghost-like, across the ridges. The mummies still lie in the hush of the caverns, wrapped in layers of woven time. Tourists walk these trails now, but the stones are not for them. They speak to those who remember. They speak in a tongue of rustling wind and shifting clouds, of icy streams that run down from peaks touched by the gods. To listen is to kneel. To kneel is to feel the echo in your bones. This is the sacred earth of the Inca, the bones of the mountain. More than memory, more than myth, a breathing inheritance. When the world forgot, the earth did not. It held the names, the dreams, the prayers. It held the fire, long buried, waiting for breath. And so the story was not only carried in blood and song, it was carried in stone, in slope and sky, in the silence between footsteps. You cannot erase a people who have become part of the mountain. You can only bow, you can only listen. In the thin air where the clouds kiss the Andes, there flies a shadow older than empire, more ancient than kings. The condor, great spirit bird, guardian of the skies, with wings stretched wide like memory itself. To the Inca, the condor was not merely a creature. It was a messenger between worlds, soaring between the realm of the living and the divine, carrying prayers to the gods and whispers back to earth. And when the empire fell, when the cities turned to ruins and the sun god's voice fell silent, the condor flew still, unbroken, unafraid. And so too did a spirit of resistance take wing. For the conquest had not ended in a single battle. It had buried itself in villages and fields, in markets and mouths, in the new tongue forced upon the old world, but it had not crushed the soul. No, the soul bled and burned, but it also rose. Not in golden armies, but in fires lit on mountaintops. Not in emperors, but in villagers who remembered how to fight with both teeth and song. The Spanish called it rebellion, but to the children of the sun it was something deeper, a sacred obligation, a vow whispered into the bones of ancestors and answered with rage and reverence. From the shadows of the Vilcabamba, where the jungle hides old blood, to the icy heights of Cusco's forgotten ridges, small uprisings flared like sparks in wind. Names echoed like drums in the valleys. Tupac Amaru, last of the royal line, dragged and executed in the square, but not silenced, not truly. Because even after the empire was crushed, his blood became legend, and his name became a weapon passed from mouth to mouth, generation to generation. In the 18th century, a man named José Gabriel Condorcanqui would rise, claiming descent from that last Inca, and he would take the name Tupac Amaru II, and with it, he would call the mountains to awaken. His was a rebellion born not just of hunger or cruelty. Though the cruelty was vast, it was born of memory, of sacred duty, of the weight of history pressing like a hand on the shoulder, whispering, "You are not finished." And so he rose, not as a king in gold, but as a storm of people tired of forgetting. Farmers, healers, children who knew the mountain paths better than the soldiers did. Mothers who passed messages baked inside loaves of bread. Men who prayed to Christ by day and to Inti by night. It was not just rebellion, it was reverence in flames. For over a year, the Andes trembled. The Spanish trembled too, because the ghosts of the Inca walked again, and though Tupac Amaru II was captured, his limbs torn by horses in a square meant to make people forget, they remembered more fiercely. Because martyrdom has always been a kind of resurrection, the condor flew over that square, and it did not cry, it watched, and it carried the scream upward, turning it into wind. The rebellion failed, by the sword, but by spirit it endured. Even in death, he became a mountain. Even in defeat, He became a chant, an echo, a fire that waited in the belly of the land. The Spanish could burn villages, they could hang leaders, but they could not untangle the belief that the land still belonged to the people, and the people to the land. And so, across generations, the fight took quieter forms. A poem passed in secret, a song sung in the rhythm of ancient drums, a quipu remembered by hands in the dark, and always the condor circled above, watching, waiting. Because resistance, too, has its seasons. It is not always sword and flame. Sometimes it is silence, sometimes it is seed. The Andes held that seed and watered it with stories and time. And in the hearts of those who knelt before both cross and stone, something wild and eternal remained. Not just grief for what was lost, but a vow to carry what remained. Rebellion, reverence, two wings of the same bird, and so the blood of the condor, the symbolic blood of the Inca, spilled but never wasted, became part of the land. And where blood sinks into soil, things grow. There are places in the Andes where the sun does not simply rise. It returns, as if answering a promise whispered by stone and sky. Each solstice, the golden light brushes against the bones of the ancient world, against carved temples and forgotten altars. And the people still gather, as they always have, waiting not just for warmth, but for meaning. This is Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun. Revived not by kings, but by memory, by longing, by those who would not let the old stories die. The empire is gone, but the Inca is not. Not in bloodline alone, but in path, in purpose. For centuries it was dangerous to speak the old tongue, to build altars, to walk barefoot into the fields and sing the hymns of sowing and harvest. Yet in silence the songs were hummed. In secret the old ways were preserved, stitched into skirts, braided into hair, passed like heirlooms of the soul. And now the people return. From Cusco to the Sacred Valley, from the shores of Lake Titicaca to the remote threads of cloud forests, the descendants of empire rised not with weapons, but with flowers, with dances, with chants that carry the syllables of their ancestors back into the wind. They walk the paths of the sun, retracing steps worn by priests and emperors, climbing terraces where potatoes once bloomed like offerings, standing before stones that once listened to stars, and they remember, not with tears alone, but with dignity. The Quechua language breathes again in classrooms, in lullabies, in the defiant laughter of children who know their grandparents' names in both worlds. The woven belts speak again, not merely of colors, but of cosmos. Each pattern, each thread, a map of time and spirit, and in those weaves, the condor, the puma, the serpent, the three worlds of Inca belief, the sky, the earth, and the depths. They return, not as doctrine, but as rhythm, as heartbeat, not in museums, but in the living body of culture. For the new Inca is not a crowned emperor. The new Inca is a pathway, a consciousness, an inheritance no longer locked to royalty, but open to any who remember the sun. They do not seek to rebuild the empire in walls of stone. They rebuild it in connection, between land and people, between ritual and soil, between past and possibility. Each time a child learns to speak to the mountains, each time a community sows with lunar rhythms, each time the corn is planted with prayers, the empire breathes again. The conquest could destroy the palaces, it could drown the manuscripts, but it could not sever the root. The Pachamama, the Earth Mother, still listens. She was never conquered. She remained beneath the feet of all invaders, receiving, enduring, waiting. Now, as global winds shift and old ways are sought again, the Inca path reveals something profound, a vision not of dominance, but of balance. To live not above the earth, but within her. To measure time not by machines, but by shadow and bloom. To to know that the stones have memory and the rivers speak, to remember that every offering, whether coca leaf or silence, is part of a great conversation. This is the legacy not of empire, but of reverence. And in this, the path of the new Inca shines. In festivals where golden costumes gleam under the Andean sky, yes, but also in the quiet dignity of a grandmother teaching her grandson how to honor the apus, in a farmer kneeling beside his field, in a girl braiding her hair with colored thread that tells the story of stars. They are not reenactments, they are resurrections, not of a power long gone, but of a spirit that never left. The sun returns, not to command, but to bless. And with it, the Inca walks again. In many forms, in many feet, in every heart that hears the mountain's quiet song and answers, I remember. The stone is quiet now, not because it has forgotten, but because it listens. The ruins of the empire stand like breath held in the still mountain air, a testament to what was and a whisper of what endures. Cusco's great plazas, once thrumming with ceremony, are now shadows cast by the setting sun. Soft and long, like the memory of a last chant fading into twilight. The empire that once wrapped the Andes in golden threads, that built roads that wound like veins across the spine of a continent, has taken its final breath. But breath is not death. Breath is a pulse, a rhythm that lingers in stone, in wind, in the silence between footsteps. The collapse was swift in violence, but slow in meaning. Each stone that toppled, each altar broken, each life taken or displaced was a stitch pulled loose from the vast tapestry of the Inca world. Yet even as the fabric unraveled, there was no sudden silence, only a soft, persistent echo. The land itself held memory. The terraces still remembered the rhythm of planting and harvest. The rivers carried the voices of ancestors downstream. The mountains kept their silent vigil. When silence falls on stone, it is not emptiness. It is space filled with waiting. Waiting for the story to be told again. Waiting for the breath to return. Even as the empire faded, new stories began to grow. Stories of survival, of adaptation, of quiet defiance. The conquerors brought their crosses in steel, but they could not claim the breath that bound the earth and sky. That breath was held by the people, in their songs, their hands, their hearts. The empire's last breath is a sacred pause, a sacred invitation, to listen closely, to hear not only what was lost, but what remains. In this silence, there is wisdom. The wisdom of knowing that empires are not eternal, that all things must pass through fire and shadow, but also the wisdom that memory is eternal, woven into the very bones of the land. This silence is a sacred space where time folds back upon itself and past and present become one. It is here, in the quiet between ruins, that the soul of the Inca speaks most clearly, not in thunder or decree, but in the hush of stone warmed by the setting sun. The last breath of empire is not an end. It is a beginning, a space for reflection, for renewal, for the earth to heal, for the people to remember, for the condor to rise once more. The road home is not always the road back. Sometimes it is a journey inward, a folding of the soul toward the place where memory and hope intertwine. After centuries of silence and shadow, the spirit of the Inca begins to return, not as a conqueror, but as a quiet witness. The people come home, to the mountains, to the rivers, to the breath of the earth beneath their feet. This homecoming is a pilgrimage of the heart, marked not by footsteps alone, but by the songs carried on the wind, by the stories told around firelight, by the slow dance of seasons turning. In villages and cities, in the bustle of markets and the hush of temples, there is a stirring, a sense that the past is waking, that the old spirit breathes again. It is a return to roots deeper than blood, to a connection older than empire. The Inca were never simply rulers of stone and gold. They were keepers of a sacred balance between sky and earth, between the seen and the unseen, between life and death. To come home is to remember that balance, to walk gently on the land, to listen with humility to the voices of the mountains. The homecoming is a reclamation, not of power, but of identity. It is a reclaiming of history's voice, of stories that were nearly lost in the dust of conquest. It is the quiet triumph of culture over erasure, of memory over oblivion. This return is a sacred dance, woven with threads of resilience and grace. The festivals that once celebrated the sun and the harvest are rekindled with joy and reverence, their rhythms beating in the hearts of new generations. Children learn the language of their ancestors, their tongues tasting the syllables of a world that once was and still is. The condor, the puma, the serpent, symbols of the ancient world, live again in woven cloth, in painted faces, in the pulse of stories told at twilight. The land receives its children with open arms, and they come bearing offerings, not of gold or conquest, but of love, respect, and remembrance. The return is not a simple journey. It is layered with pain and loss, with hope and healing. It asks those who walk it to carry the weight of history and the lightness of possibility. And so, the spirit of the Inca walks once more, in the footsteps of the living, in the echoes of the past, in the heartbeat of the earth itself. The road home winds on, infinite and sacred. The story of the Inca is a thread, woven through time, through stone and sky, through the breath of the earth itself. It is not confined to the pages of history, nor the silent ruins scattered beneath the clouds. It lives in the hands that still plant the fields, in the songs whispered by the wind, in the eyes of those who carry its memory. Legacy is not what empires leave behind in monuments alone, but what they leave within the hearts of those who come after. The Inca legacy is an eternal thread, unbroken, resilient, alive. It is the pulse beneath the Andes, the shadow of the condor soaring high, the soft murmur of the rivers that run like lifeblood through the valleys. This thread ties the past to the present and pulls the future close. It teaches that power is not only in conquest, but in stewardship, of land, of people, of spirit. It reminds us that even in collapse, there is beauty, there is learning, there is transformation. The story of the Inca invites us to listen, to the silence of stone, to the wisdom of earth, to the whispers of the sun. It calls us to remember that we are part of a greater whole, woven into the vast tapestry of existence, and in this remembering, we find meaning, not in the might of kings, but in the enduring spirit of a people. The eternal thread weaves on, through every breath, every step, every heartbeat, and as we close this chapter, we carry it with us. A sacred gift, a timeless journey, a story told not only to fall asleep to, but to awaken with.